The United States has defended Europe for generations. And the president said, all he said was that our jets would need to take off from bases in Europe or our ships from ports to strike targets in the Middle East. Iranian targets that threaten European interests even more directly than they threaten us. But too many of our allies said no, or tried to drown us in arcane legal debates, or criticized us publicly for doing what they aren't prepared or able to do themselves. It was shameful. I'm announcing today a 6-month Department of War review that will examine America's force posture and basing in Europe.
As Washington recalibrates its posture, is Trump quietly starting revenge against Europe for abandoning US plans and refusing to fully back his Iran war campaign? With Pete Hegseth openly reviewing deployments, is Washington now ready to pull troops and key weapons out of Europe just as Putin's shadow looms larger over the continent? Is the war chief's lethal warning to NATO that support can no longer be assumed now sending shockwaves through European capitals that long relied on American backup? Is this really a sober plan to end over-dependence on Europe, or is the continent being punished for staying away from Trump's Iran adventure when Washington wanted a united front? As America's munition stockpiles come under fresh scrutiny, Washington is starting to rewrite its entire Europe strategy, questioning how much force it can keep tied down on the continent. On June 18th, War Secretary Pete Hegseth announced a 6-month review of American troop deployments across Europe, signaling that the current footprint is no longer guaranteed. The review will include consultations with Congress on future force levels, opening the door to possible cuts or relocations of units that have been in Europe for decades. Hegseth also sharply criticized allies that withheld support during the Iran war, hinting that countries which sat it out may now see fewer American assets on their soil.
The United States has defended Europe for generations. And the president said, all he said was that our jets would need to take off from bases in Europe or our ships from ports to strike targets in the Middle East. Iranian targets that threaten European interests even more directly than they threaten us. But too many of our allies said no, or tried to drown us in arcane legal debates, or criticized us publicly for doing what they aren't prepared or able to do themselves. It was shameful. I'm announcing today a 6-month Department of War review that will examine America's force posture and basing in Europe. Up to 6 months, could be less. Let's call it the NATO 3.0 review. This review will be conducted with the benefit of inputs from the United States military, from European Command. It will involve consultations with the US Congress and with our allies. It's a review that some countries will fail, and others will pass with flying colors. In the end, the review is intended to both improve US force posture and basing and strengthen NATO 3.0. Well, Mr. Secretary General, and for too long, NATO has been a paper tiger and a one-way street. No more. And that's what the Hague Summit is all about. That's what defense spending commitments are all about, transforming NATO back into a real military alliance that's focused on hard power and real deterrence, a NATO 3.0. Europe was not supposed to be a dependency of the United States. That's not what Winston Churchill or Charles de Gaulle or Konrad Adenauer wanted or expected. No, Europe was supposed to be a military power, allied with a strong America. NATO's power did not come from committees or from meetings or from small flags on fancy tables. It came from warriors. And for Europe's defense, it had come from NATO allies. That was NATO 1.0. A hard-edged warfighting organization focused on Europe's defense. But that spirit faded after the Cold War ended. Some of our allies have gotten the message and stepped up. You know who you are, and we very much appreciate it. Last year, under President Trump's leadership, NATO set the new global standard for allied defense spending. 5% of GDP, all in on defense. It's historic, and it's transformational. And some allies are already well on their way to meeting this ambitious target, and in some cases ahead of schedule. Too many allies still don't recognize the historic need that President Trump has made clear to them and to NATO itself to reforge a relevant, powerful military alliance. As President Trump put it, and rightfully so, he gave our allies a test to support America when we asked for their help, and too many failed it.
Washington has already begun shrinking the assets pledged to NATO's crisis response pool, cutting back what would be available if an emergency erupted on Europe's flank. Reports say the number of F-15 and F-15E fighter jets earmarked for NATO duty will fall by about 1/3, dropping to just 99 aircraft on call. The number of MQ-4 and MQ-9 Reaper drones available to NATO will also be cut roughly in half, weakening the alliance's long-range surveillance and strike options. These reductions do not stop at fighters and drones. They also hit refueling aircraft, naval vessels, and other critical capabilities that NATO planners depend on in a crisis. Military sources caution that full details of the cuts have not been made public, leaving allies guessing which exact assets could disappear from the shared pool. NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte has confirmed that the drawdown from the crisis response pool has already begun, turning quiet planning into concrete change. Rutte says the cuts will affect day-to-day planning and readiness, but insists allies would still maximize all available forces if an actual war broke out. According to alliance officials, Washington quietly informed NATO last month that crisis force contributions would shrink, giving planners limited time to adjust. These moves come just weeks before a major NATO summit in Ankara on July the 7th and 8th, where burden sharing and Russian threats are expected to dominate the agenda.
The United States expressed strong commitment to NATO very clearly today. And we also heard about the importance of a more equitable distribution of labor and how we must rebalance our security for the better. Secretary Hegseth was very clear about the need for a NATO 3.0, an alliance rebooted for the modern age. On that, we all agree. We heard the US announcement to review force posture in Europe. In today's dynamic security environment, I think it is prudent to ensure NATO's forces are optimally arrayed to deter conflict and, if necessary, to defend against any threat. There was also broad agreement among allies on the need to step up as the US adjusts its pledges to the NATO force model. The NATO force model is about planning. And planning is crucial if we are to be prepared. Allies have already filled some of the slots completely, others are nearly complete, others require more work. Allies in the nuclear planning group also met today to address NATO's nuclear capabilities, which are the ultimate guarantor of Allied security. I welcome the statement released by the MPG, which demonstrates Allies' commitment to NATO's nuclear deterrence and reiterates our unity and our resolve. As the statement makes clear, we will continue to modernize our nuclear capabilities, improve planning, and adapt to ensure our nuclear deterrence remains fit for purpose. We today will shortly start a meeting of the Ukraine Defense Contact Group, which President Zelensky will join. Ukraine is changing the dynamic on the battlefield and inflicting huge losses on Russia. But they can only keep doing this if we step up our support, not just for immediate needs, such as air defense, but assessing how we can work together over the long term to ensure Ukraine can remain sovereign, free, and secure. Because Ukraine's security is important for our own security. And with that, I'm ready to take your questions.
Okay, let's start here in the second row, Bloomberg.
Thank you, Secretary General. I want to come back to the force model. Of course, there's a force model, and then there is the announcement of the force posture review this morning. I want to clarify one thing. What will be NATO, especially NATO's European and Canadian allies' strategy? Will it be to replace everything, or will it be to figure out a new way to achieve the same aims with the means available? Because it seems that you suggested that everything would be replaced, not immediately, but that would ultimately be replaced, but certain of the things that have been reassigned in the force model, for example, strategic bombers, Europe simply doesn't have. So are you saying there will be plans to replace those assets, or a third way, perhaps?
Well,
Thank you.
First of all, I'm sorry that I cannot get into what is exactly in the NATO force model. I know that some news outlets have reported on it. I cannot confirm whether that was true what they reported, because we are saying nothing about it. We don't want to make the Russians any wiser. I think it is good to know what the NATO force model is. And basically, I can quote Sakur here, the Supreme Allied Commander. What he is saying basically is that the NATO force model is there so that he knows what he can count on in case of a simultaneous multi-theater conflict. And it's for planning purposes. That means that if ultimately you would get into a situation of a real war, a real Article 5 situation, if we were under attack, then of course it is reasonable to assume that allies would do all they can to defend ourselves. So this is for planning purposes. As I said this morning, this is immediate. So what the US is doing here is immediate for planning purposes, but it doesn't mean it's not there if necessary. It is to make sure that the US can provide what they really can provide in case of a multi-theater threat. And therefore it was so important what Sakur said, I think yesterday, that it makes the plans more realistic and therefore stronger, because there was an over-reliance on the United States.
Interestingly, the drawdown is happening just as NATO sounds the alarm over renewed Russian threat, warning allies that Moscow may be testing for new openings. A Swedish assessment has warned that Moscow might even strike a NATO member if it believes conditions are favorable, aiming to catch the alliance off balance. Officials fear the real objective would be to test NATO's unity and its Article 5 pledge, probing whether all members would truly rally if one was attacked. The trim also follows months of intense operations against Iranian targets, which have stretched American logistics and worn down key parts of its arsenal. Reports indicate that missiles, air defense interceptors, and high-end air assets were all run hard during the Iran campaign, forcing Washington to rethink how much it can spare for Europe. Patriot missile shortages have deepened as US allies face growing uncertainty over future deliveries and replenishment schedules. Lockheed Martin Vice President Brian Dunn said allied nations could not be given firm timelines on when new missile deliveries would arrive. Dunn said final allocation decisions would be made by Washington rather than industry, according to the Financial Times. The warning came as demand for Patriot interceptors surged following the Iran conflict and other global security crises. Countries including Germany, Poland, Japan, the UAE, and Saudi Arabia continue to rely heavily on Patriot air defense systems. Dunn said Lockheed Martin was rapidly expanding production capacity for PAC-3 interceptor missiles to meet rising demand. The company has agreed to increase annual output from about 650 missiles to roughly 2,000 by 2033. The production expansion forms part of a broader $4.7 billion agreement reached between Lockheed Martin and the Pentagon. Dunn said higher production would help ease shortages over time, but would not guarantee quicker deliveries to customers. He stressed that Lockheed Martin has no authority over which countries receive missiles first under US allocation decisions. On June 10th, the Financial Times reported that US allies had already been warned to expect delays in Patriot missile deliveries. Ukraine has continued to depend heavily on Patriot batteries to defend against Russian missile and drone attacks. Analysts said interceptor shortages have made the task of protecting Ukrainian cities increasingly difficult. The Iran conflict has also added fresh pressure as US stockpiles face significant operational demands. According to the Financial Times, Washington has moved to replenish inventories that were depleted during recent conflicts. The supply crunch has also encouraged several European countries to explore alternatives to US-made air defense systems. Lockheed executive Paula Hartley said many allied governments were becoming increasingly frustrated by delivery delays. Hartley said several countries were now questioning both US availability and broader policy decisions regarding allocations.